A ceasefire exists on paper. But right now in Washington, Trump's own advisors are telling him to restart the bombing. Iran's negotiators are publicly warning, and I want you to listen to this carefully, that they are, quote, prepared for every option. The Strait of Hormuz is still closed. Oil is near $105 a barrel. And the man sitting in the Oval Office just called the peace proposal from Tehran, and these are his words, a piece of garbage. So let's be direct about where we are. This war did not end. It paused. And that pause may be over. This story broke on Monday, May 11th, 2026 at the White House. Standing before reporters, President Trump was asked about the state of negotiations with Iran. His answer was stark. He called the ceasefire unbelievably weak and Iran's peace proposal unacceptable. And then he described the ongoing truce as on life support. Some Trump aides have now told CNN that he is more seriously considering a resumption of major combat operations than he has been in recent weeks. And the timing of all this matters enormously, because on Tuesday, May 12th, Trump boarded a plane, not to a military command center, but to Beijing, China, for a high-stakes summit with President Xi Jinping. Two U.S. officials said they don't believe Trump would order military action against Iran before he returns from China. So right now, we're in a window, a narrow, dangerous, extremely unstable window between a collapsing ceasefire and a decision that could send this conflict into a completely new phase. If you want fact-based, fast-moving coverage of this story without the noise, subscribe now, because this is developing by the hour. Let's go back to how we got here. The U.S.-Iran conflict began earlier this year, a war involving American and Israeli air operations against Iran, now stretching across multiple fronts. Both Iran and the U.S. have exchanged fire in the Strait of Hormuz since a ceasefire took effect, meaning even the so-called pause in fighting was never completely quiet. In early May, Washington put forward a peace framework, a set of terms designed to formally end the conflict. Iran's response came back on Sunday, May 10th. Trump's reaction was immediate, and it was not diplomatic. He called the offer unacceptable and a piece of garbage. What exactly did Iran propose? Tehran's response focused on ending the war on all fronts, including in Lebanon, where U.S. ally Israel is fighting Iranian-backed Hezbollah fighters. Iran also demanded compensation for war damage, emphasized its sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, called for the United States to end its naval blockade, guarantee no further attacks, lift sanctions, and remove the ban on Iranian oil sales. That last part, the nuclear question, is where things broke down. Trump said Iran had agreed to relinquish its stockpile of enriched uranium to the U.S., but the Iranians apparently reversed course because their latest response omitted any mention of the issue entirely. That reversal appears to be what pushed Trump from frustration into something closer to a decision point. Trump grew impatient with the continued closure of the Strait of Hormuz, as well as what he perceives as division in Iranian leadership that is preventing them from making substantial concessions on nuclear talks. He described Tehran's leadership as split between, in his words, moderates and lunatics. Iran's response was equally direct. Iran's top negotiator, Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, said his country is prepared for every option as negotiations remain at an impasse. Our armed forces are prepared to deliver a lesson-giving response to any aggression, Ghalibaf wrote on social media. He went further. There is no alternative but to accept the rights of the Iranian people as laid out in the 14-point proposal, Ghalibaf added. Two sides, zero overlap, and a ceasefire that was already shaky, now described in terms of a patient fading on a hospital ventilator. Trump was also briefed at the White House on military options by U.S. military leadership, a detail that has not received enough attention. Because when a president under pressure sits down with generals and reviews strike packages, that is not a routine briefing. And then there's the number nobody wants to talk about out loud. Pentagon Comptroller Jules Hurst told House lawmakers Tuesday that the U.S. war against Iran is now estimated to have cost around $29 billion, up from an earlier estimate of $25 billion in late April, due to updated repair and replacement costs and ongoing operational expenses. $29 billion, and it's still climbing. Here is something that almost got lost in the headlines. U.S. officials described one of Trump's options as striking the 25% of military targets they identified, but deliberately chose not to hit during the initial campaign. That was a decision made with strategy in mind. Hold something back, leave leverage on the table, keep options open. The question now is whether that leverage is about to be used. Start with the water. The Strait of Hormuz is a 21-mile wide channel at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. It is functionally the most important shipping choke point on the planet for energy. Before this conflict began, it carried 20% of the world's oil and natural gas supply. It is currently not functioning normally. Crude oil prices are up around 45%, or some $30 a barrel since the war started. Around 10 to 12 million barrels of crude remain choked off from global markets per day. Think about what that means practically. Supply has been cut. Prices have been pushed up. Inflation follows. The cost of shipping everything that depends on fuel, food, medicine, electronics, manufactured goods goes up with it. The U.S. released 53.3 million barrels from its Strategic Petroleum Reserve as part of a broader International Energy Agency initiative involving more than 30 countries, aimed at adding around 400 million barrels to the global market. A Saudi oil giant warned that oil markets won't return to normal this year if the Strait of Hormuz doesn't reopen soon. That warning comes directly from the kingdom that controls more spare production capacity than almost any other nation on earth. When Saudi Arabia tells you the market can't absorb this, that is not a minor statement. Do you think this situation escalates further, or is there still a deal to be made? I want to know what you think. Drop your take in the comments. Now, here's where the China dimension becomes impossible to ignore. Trump is heading to Beijing for a summit with President Xi Jinping. China has long been a close ally of Iran and is the main importer of Iranian oil. Beijing has been quietly urging Tehran to reach a deal. U.S. officials say Trump is expected to discuss the Iran war with Xi Jinping, and China has been urging Iran to accept terms. But China is also the country most economically invested in Iranian oil flows continuing. That is a contradiction that sits at the center of the entire negotiation architecture. If Trump arrives in Beijing and asks Xi to pressure Iran, what does Xi ask for in return? What does that conversation look like? And what happens to the ceasefire calculus while that meeting unfolds thousands of miles away from the Strait of Hormuz? A regional source told CNN that the talks are unlikely to make significant progress until Trump meets Xi this week, which means we are being asked to watch a ceasefire survive on life support, while the man holding the plug boards a plane to meet the one leader who might have the most influence over what Iran does next. Here is the detail that should be making more headlines than it is. Iran's negotiators have told reporters in Tehran that their country was already engaged in negotiations, not once, but twice in the past year, when the unprecedented air campaign began. They are now demanding security assurances because they believe they walked into a trap before. That is Iran's actual negotiating position, not aggression, not defiance, fear of being hit again mid-talk. And here's the contradiction. Trump is describing a divided Iranian leadership incapable of making deals, while simultaneously, Iran's parliament speaker is delivering a coherent, structured 14-point proposal. Those two things cannot both be true in the way they're being framed. Which side is misreading the other? And what happens if both sides are? There is a tendency in covering conflicts of this scale to speak entirely in the language of strategy and oil prices and diplomacy, barrels per day, billions of dollars, 14-point proposals. But somewhere behind all of that, there are people. In Iran, a cloud of mistrust has settled over everyday life in Tehran, where residents have watched their country absorb an unprecedented campaign of airstrikes and are now living through a naval blockade that their government says amounts to piracy. Iranian officials described frozen banking assets, severed oil revenues, and a population being told their sovereignty is under siege. That is not abstract. An economy under sanctions, at war, with a naval blockade and frozen international assets, is an economy where ordinary people, the ones who had nothing to do with any policy decision, face shortages, inflation, and fear in ways that compound every day the conflict continues. Kuwait announced it had arrested 4 alleged infiltrators linked to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, accusing them of attempting to enter Bubiyan Island by sea to carry out what Kuwaiti authorities described as hostile acts. The arrests signal just how far the instability has spread beyond the 2 primary belligerents. Kuwait, a country that has historically tried to maintain balance between regional powers, is now publicly announcing IRGC-linked arrests on its territory. In Lebanon, the human cost has been accumulating separately, but in direct connection to the same conflict. An Israeli airstrike on a house in the town of Kfar Dunin killed 6 people and wounded 7, according to Lebanon's national news agency. The injured were taken to hospitals in Tyre. The cumulative toll from Israeli attacks in Lebanon since March 2nd stands at 2,869 killed and 8,730 wounded, according to the Lebanese Health Ministry. Israel and Hezbollah, the Iranian-backed paramilitary group, have continued exchanging fire, which has intensified in recent days, despite a ceasefire deal between the Lebanese and Israeli governments that was intended to pave the way for peace talks. So understand the geometry of this. There is a ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran that Trump calls life support. There is a separate ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon that both sides are openly violating. Iran backs Hezbollah, the U.S. backs Israel, and the Strait of Hormuz, the artery that connects the Persian Gulf to the rest of the global economy, remains effectively closed. U.S. Ambassador to Israel Mike Huckabee confirmed that Israel has sent Iron Dome batteries and personnel to the United Arab Emirates to help it defend against Iranian attacks. That detail is extraordinary. Israel deploying its most advanced missile defense system to the UAE to defend an Arab Gulf state against a potential Iranian strike represents a level of regional military integration that would have been almost unthinkable even a few years ago. The map of alliances and vulnerabilities in the Gulf is being redrawn in real time. And at the center of all of it, energy. For people in Asia, in Europe, in North and South America, every time you pay for fuel or buy groceries that required refrigerated transport or pay an electricity bill, the Strait of Hormuz is in that number. World oil consumption was around 103 million barrels per day last year, with 10 to 12 million barrels per day still choked off from markets. That is roughly a 10% supply disruption to the global economy, and it has been running for weeks. That is not a footnote to a diplomatic dispute. That is a slow, grinding pressure applied to billions of people who never voted on this war, never negotiated its terms, and have no way to influence its outcome. 3 options are now reportedly on Trump's desk. The first, resume Project Freedom, the U.S. operation to escort ships through the Strait of Hormuz, which was suspended last week. The second, restart the bombing campaign and strike the 25% of military targets that were identified but not yet hit. The third, a special forces operation to physically secure Iran's enriched uranium stockpile, which Israeli officials are pushing for, and which Trump is reportedly hesitant to order because of how dangerous it is. Those are not abstract policy options. Each one carries a different level of risk, a different potential Iranian response, and a different message to China, to Russia, and to every government watching this play out. 2 U.S. officials said they believe Trump will take some form of military action against Iran to increase pressure on the regime and force nuclear concessions. If that assessment is correct, the question isn't whether the ceasefire holds. The question is what comes after it doesn't. Step back for a moment. What we are witnessing is not simply a bilateral standoff between the United States and Iran, as significant as that would be on its own. What we are watching is the collision of at least 4 major forces: American military pressure, Iranian political fracture, Chinese economic self-interest, and a global energy market that cannot tolerate much more disruption, all arriving at the same pressure point at the same time. The negotiations deadlock stems from a fundamental asymmetry. Trump is seeking what analysts describe as a quick triumph that includes immediate concessions on Iran's nuclear program, while Tehran wants a phased approach: end the war first, address nuclear issues later. That is not a small gap. That is a structurally incompatible set of priorities. One side says, give us the nuclear concessions first, then we'll talk about peace. The other side says, guarantee our security first, then we'll discuss anything else. And here's what makes the China trip so strategically complex. Beijing has enormous leverage over Tehran. It is Iran's primary oil customer and one of its last remaining major economic partners. If Xi Jinping tells Tehran to make a deal, that carries real weight. But China also benefits in certain ways from American overextension in the Middle East. A prolonged U.S. military commitment in the Gulf is a U.S. commitment not fully focused elsewhere, including the Pacific. China has been urging Iran to reach a deal, but whether that pressure is strong enough to break the deadlock depends entirely on what China actually wants from this conversation. And we don't know that yet. Meanwhile, Iran's IRGC-linked arrests in Kuwait signal that proxy operations have not stopped, even as the main ceasefire limps along. The machinery of the conflict has not wound down. It is simply paused at the top level while continuing to operate at multiple lower levels. The nuclear question, the one Trump says Iran agreed to and then walked back, is the core of everything. If Iran retains a meaningful nuclear program after this conflict ends, the entire strategic calculus of the Middle East shifts. Saudi Arabia has already publicly indicated that it would seek its own nuclear capabilities if Iran gets them. The UAE is watching. Israel is watching. Turkey is watching. What happens in the next 72 hours, while Trump is in Beijing and advisors in Washington are reviewing strike packages, will define whether this conflict enters a new chapter or whether some kind of framework emerges that allows both sides to claim enough of a win to step back. Nobody knows which way it goes. That ambiguity is not a media narrative. It is the actual state of things. This story is moving faster than almost any major geopolitical crisis in recent memory, and the next development could come from a summit room in Beijing, a briefing room in Washington, or a naval incident in the Strait of Hormuz. What do you think happens next? Does Trump order a strike before he returns from China? Or does the Beijing summit change the calculation entirely? Drop your analysis in the comments. And subscribe, because the next update on this story could be the one that changes everything we thought we knew about where this is heading.